Hi, I'm Chris McLean from Stonechair Capital. Earlier, I had the opportunity to sit down with Philip Morkel of Hydrgas and hear how renewable energy could save millions of lives and feed a country. Let's dive into that discussion with Philip Morkel of Hydrgas and learn more about energy and Africa.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for joining us, folks. And I've got a really interesting company and individual for us to speak with this week. Philip Morkel is the CEO of Hydrgas, and Hydrgas has a very unique opportunity to be able to produce energy in a very much needed area, but on industrial scale, and also have an extreme impact from both a carbon credit point of view and a way of life credit for the people of Rwanda and the DRC. So with that, Philip, good morning. Thanks for joining us today. What I'd like you to start out with, if you don't mind, is can you tell us about your project? Can you just give us a sense of what Hydrogas is about?
Yeah, Hydrogas it's essentially created to do this one project. That was the sense that we got into it with. But we're finding now that it has much wider ramifications and potential. And, whereas the topic was 20 years ago when I first heard about this resource, when I first visited the resource, it was about how do we get some gas out and make some power for a country that's severely lacking in power. Fast forward 20 years, it's about global warming, climate change, a really big threat, let's say, which exists for the people of Rwanda and DRC around the lake. Highlighted perhaps just this last week by the volcano that's been erupting there. And once again posing something of a threat, didn't turn out that way, to the people around the lake. So it is a much wider story, and it's got much wider ramifications for the people of the area.
So what is it that Hydrogas proposes to do with the assets of the lake?
Well, let's go back to the first question I was asked 20 years ago.
Okay.
And it was simply, something about gas. We've got this gas resource here. It's a kind of unique one in a lake, and it's a big lake. It's about the size, it's one of Africa's Great Lakes. It's about the size of Lake Ontario, at least in terms of water content, but it's quite a lot deeper. It's almost 500 meters deep. And with that, the bottom half of this lake has turned into a reservoir built up over perhaps 2 millennia of natural gas and carbon dioxide. Now, that's both a threat and frankly, a huge opportunity. So the question I was asked 20 years ago and had worked on was, can you get the gas out? Yeah, we've answered that question. We can get it out. We've pilot tested it. But the ramifications got a lot more complex when they said, can you get it out safely in a way that's not going to cause a bigger problem than you're solving for the region? And so that has been essentially 20 years of work, mostly done with a group of international experts. I was appointed onto this group some 14 years ago. And we've been working hard to understand that. So parallel to the idea of how to figure out how to exploit the resource is how to exploit it safely.
So who asked you to do these things?
Well, the first request was the governments of both Rwanda and the DRC, who share the resource 50-50. They share the lake 50-50. They have been trying since probably the 1960s to figure out how to get the gas out the lake. And a Belgian company, UCB, did a job 1963 to 65, where they put a pipe in the lake and they figured out, yes, they could get gas out. And they actually got enough out to run a small brewery's boilers nearby. It's actually a Heineken-owned brewery. So this had been the case up until I first went there. It was still operating. There was an inkling at the time that the gas, there's a lot of it, and there were stories out, there were researchers out sensing that there could be both a problem and an opportunity here. And the problem being this gas is renewable. It's renewable because the lake itself is full of algae in the top 60 meters where it's oxic. And for the bottom 420, 430 odd meters, it's anoxic. And the dead algae, as it drops down, converts to CO2 and methane. So they figured out they could get some out, and it was poor quality gas, couldn't be used for much. So after a number of years, after the genocide, I went there some 7 years after the genocide. They said, look, we're desperately short of energy. We need something. Government had handed over the problem to private enterprise and said, can you figure out what to do with this? So I was approached both by the brewery and one of the banks in Rwanda, BCDI, and they said, could you come up with a plan to get this gas out? So I went up there at the invitation. The invitation came to the South African government. The invitation was passed on to me, and I went up there with a Dr. Howard Roberts. We both visited the site in 2001, took a look around, and I got to confess, I was sitting on the shores of the lake looking at the plant that they'd built, still operating, and said, this is not the best idea. I have another idea. And the light bulb moment really came on then. You talk about inspiration and perspiration. That was 2 seconds of inspiration and 20 years of perspiration since then to try and take the idea and bring it to fruition. So with that private enterprise thing, we did a feasibility study and showed, yeah, the old tech wasn't much good. The new tech was a lot better. And we ought to go ahead with something. So we did a pilot test back in 2004. And we showed, yes, the new tech that I'd come up with, which enables us to build the extraction plant completely underwater, sort of hidden from view, was quite a neat thing, and it should go forward. But then, as always, these things get complicated. We were working on feasibility studies based on the results of the test work we'd done, which was a good start. Several other companies, privateers, were working on both testing and feasibility study. And in 2007, the World Bank called a conference of the interested parties. Included mainly experts. It was a lot of government people. It was the government, the DRC too. And it was held on the shores of Lake Kivu at Gisenyi. And we discussed what to do. A lot of technical academic papers presented. And out of that, they created an expert working group. I was one of 6 people co-opted onto it. We were given a week to go and decide how to do this all safely. It took 3 years. The week turned into a very, very long week. And, you know, on a pro bono basis, when you say you'll do a week for free and you do 3 years of work and perhaps 5,000 hours, that's a different thing. Absolutely. So we worked as a group. We met frequently, and by May, June of 2009, we'd actually formulated the rules and regulations for the safe production of gas from the lake.
So let's talk about this. You've mentioned this a few times. We can get gas out of the lake, and you've used the word, as you just did now, safe.
Yep.
What is the issue around safety with removing this biogenic gas from the lake? What's the safety issue?
Well, it cuts in two directions. The first thing is it is a renewable resource. It's trapped in situ in the lake because it's a uniquely layered lake. There are other layered lakes, but this one's got 5 layers to it. And it's stratified by density gradients, which form at certain levels. And the formation of that is quite complex in itself. It has to do with flows through rainfall that falls on the lava and flows down into the lake at various depths. Now, that causes a stratification. The stratification, if it's a strong enough density gradient over a short vertical distance, which happens at 260 meters deep in the lake, it's a trap. It traps gas below it. There's no possibility of gas diffusing up through that, or very small, and it's decreasing over time. So what that meant is as algae dies, it is digested by what's called the acetate process. It produces, I think, 2 molecules of CO2 and 1 molecule of methane from the let's call it the dead algae lying at the bottom of the lake. And this just builds up and builds up. And it's built up to the point that in American terms, it's 2 trillion cubic feet of methane and about 10 trillion cubic feet of CO2 in the lake. And from a measurement done in 1975 to a follow-up measurement done about the time I was testing on the lake in 2004, it had built up about 30%. That implies a big acceleration in buildup. And with that acceleration, one has to look at it and say, what's going to happen with that? Now, that means that that accelerated rate, if it continued on that trend, by about 2080, it will have built up to the point that several levels would be at 100% saturated with gas. Now, that gets to be catastrophic because that means it erupts. This lake is last reported to, trying to go through the data, the sort of logging of drill cores through the bottom of the lake bed. About 2,000 years ago was the last eruption. So this is now building up to a further eruption of the lake. Now, if it was as predictable and simple as that, we'd be okay. But there are other incidents, and most clearly highlighted by the eruption of Mount Nyiragongo looming over the lake on the north shore. The lake is actually dammed by 2 very live volcanoes, Nyiragongo and Nyamulagira.
Yeah.
And these have built up massive amounts of lava, probably 4,000 meters of it in the case of, or 4,300 meters high, but 3,000 meters of lava buildup to Mount Nyiragongo and almost as much Nyamulagira. So they dammed the lake, they've made it deeper, they have stratified it with the water flowing through and dissolving salts and creating density layers. But the capacity of that to hold gas is now predicted to top out at 2080. But being a volcanic environment, there are 2 mechanisms by which this can go south very quickly. One is a massive eruption of a new cone, perhaps coming up on the volcano. The second one is for a large seismic split at the bottom of the lake. This has also been researched by several of these experts. And that could just put so much heat so suddenly at the bottom of the lake that it causes the lake to almost boil up and release all this gas. So those are 2 possible catastrophic eruptions that could occur.
So now we're at a point where the gas is at a high enough level that it can be, for lack of a better word, farmed,
Yes.
because it continues to grow and regenerate. So you can farm the lake for a natural resource that is clean, that is efficient, and keeps we'll call it this bubble in check. Now, since your 3-year sojourn into pro bono work, others have tried to tackle this problem as well. Have they been able to deal with this 30% accelerated growth and mine the lake with an efficient way? Or are there issues with having more people continue to mine the lake?
Well, the process of getting rights to work on the lake, etc., has been, well, it's divided in two parts. As a group of experts, the World Bank wanted us to define clear rules for farming the lake. I actually use the term harvesting, although farming itself has a very interesting correlation within this. In terms of harvesting the lake, it needs to be done in a certain way. What was done in 1965, that plant lasted until 2003, when it was just so corroded it couldn't work anymore. That was minuscule compared to the rate of regeneration of gas. What was built in 2007-8 by it started off with an international consortium, Norwegian, Israeli, Scottish interests. They started to build it. The government threw some money into it, which somehow got purloined. And then the government said, well, you've stolen our money, we're going to take possession. And they paid some $22 million to complete the exercise to build what was called KP1. This was a single barge with about a meter diameter pipe going to the bottom of the lake. And it worked kind of. It didn't produce more than a third of what was projected. And this was because they didn't really have much science going for it in terms of how to get this going. The technology was essentially the same as the 1965 version, just put into a barge on the lake instead of being fed by a pipe to the side of the lake. So it worked in a fashion, but very expensive gas and power to get out of that. They produced sometimes about 1 megawatt, 1 and a bit.
Wow, expensive experiment.
It was an expensive experiment, and at about that time, some US private interests got involved too. Contour Global announced an agreement with the Rwanda government in 2008, I think it was March, that they were going to build a $345 million 100 megawatt gas extraction system. So this was a massive scale up, 100 times.
Yeah.
However, they were going to just build it straight up without going through what was recommended in the management prescriptions, the document that we worked 3 years on.
Right, yeah.
For Lake Kivu's development. They went one shot to build the first thing. They were present at some of the discussions that we had in Copenhagen about the rules and the regulations. But they decided to proceed anyway, although it looked like it wasn't going to be rules compliant at all. They built their plant. It took some 7 years. It was 25 megawatt installation. And it probably was several times over budget. I don't know exactly how much. It was reputed to have cost over $200 million. So once again, you had an expensive way of getting gas out. But our concern as a group of experts was that not only was the expense was a private investment issue, but the workability of the solution was more problematic, in as much as it was non-compliant with some serious parts of the rules, which said this is how you harvest the lake and keep it safe.
There's an important conditionality of the whole process.
It was certainly important, and it was a matter of some discussion. But since the two governments, one of the recommendations we had as a group of experts was that the two governments would form a bilateral authority, which would do various things like vet any designs to see if they were compliant. They would put a whole lot of requirements on the developer to see that they'd done it properly, that they'd done it according to the rules, that they tested it and showed it to be effective before they go scale up to very large scale. As it turned out, the company decided that they would proceed anyway. They didn't need to be too concerned about these rules. And they did eventually commission their plant in 2015. But it's been a troubled operation. Their early startups were aborted because of problems. In fact, at one stage, there were clouds of gas bubbles coming up around this facility because
wow.
Essentially it was engineering error. They were putting water that was wash water that was far too saturated with gas back in, and it was just bubbling out again. And in its extreme form, it can cause the whole platform to sink.
And or the crew to all pass out with poisoning. But yeah, that's another.
Well, that would have been a byproduct of it, although in as much as they were washing the gas, the toxic gas, hydrogen sulfide, is very soluble. So it tends to get trapped in the water. So they were okay on that point. But it was a difficult time for them, and I think they're still struggling to see how they can eventually build 4 of these units, which is the original plan.
So now enter Hydrgas. Hydrgas says, look, things haven't been going the way we all said they should. I see an opportunity to be able to make a company that can supply energy to not just one country, but to 2 countries potentially. And I wrote the rules. I know how to follow them. So is that really where you're at right now?
Yeah, well, certainly to say I wrote the rules, yeah, I was the scribe of a group of experts, and I'm the only non-PhD on that group. So I don't put myself as the eminent scientist in the group. I was more the practical guy that can build projects and had some pretty well-developed ideas on how to extract the gas better. And this is the nub of what goes on here. The legacy technology and the variants of those of what was built by the Belgians in '65, what was built by the government and an Israeli group in 2008, and what was built by Contour Global by 2015, they all use forms of what we call legacy technology. And the fault with legacy technology is you draw the water up from anywhere from 300 meters to 480 meters deep. They do it at 330. They draw this water up, put it through a separation stage, which is underwater. They then take the gas that comes off that, which is about 75 to 80% CO2, and scrub it. They wash it with water. Carbon dioxide is 25% more, 25 times more soluble than methane. So if you scrub it enough with water, you get a better quality gas. So they do get a gas out of that, and then they take that, compress it, and take it to shore. The trouble is that the efficiency of their process is such. Oh, by the way, a key point here is they then release the water that has been degassed far too shallow in the lake. It's denser water than is there. So what happens is you get this massive plume of water going down, and it effectively breaks through the key one of these density layers. And that is the biggest concern we have with legacy technologies, is they don't seem to have the capability of discharging water at depth where it was originated. One of the rules that was made up, there's 14 technical rules. One of them is that where you take the water from, you return it to that zone, that depth zone.
Now,
And
if the call it current, I'll call it volcanic activity continues, if some of the things that you said are that we dealt with that are potentially create problems that reduce the safeness of it, in the formula that you're looking at approaching and returning water to depth and the way that you scrub it and the way you deal with the layers and the different weights of the water, how does it react to those things? Why are you, call it, safe or to be trusted with this process than the last guy? What is it about the new technology or the new way of looking at it?
well, first of all, in order to get this to work, what you're relying on to lift this gas and water up, to run it through the process system and out, is powered by gas lift. The quantities of water pumped through these systems is vast. If you actually ran a pump to do that, you'd probably use half the energy that you produce to do so. So you rely on a natural phenomenon called gas lift, because as you take water with a lot of gas dissolved in it vertically upwards, you depressurize it, gas starts to come out of solution, it bubbles out, and it changes the density of water in that column. That causes it to lift, and that drives it through the process. But using what they've got is a kind of weak process. It only just makes it around, and it hasn't got enough energy to push it all the way down to where it needs to be.
Gotcha.
The alternative that we've got at the core of the Hydrgas process is we have an accelerated, excited degassing process. And on the spot where we do it, it actually causes gas to come out of solution 1,000 times faster than it would naturally. That means it's coming out of solution deeper. That means the process has got much more driving force. This density difference of the column of water is much greater, and it drives it around strongly. So we can drive it through the process and back down to where it's supposed to be. That's one thing. The second thing is that the gas comes out, and we do it in multiple stages. And that means the gas that first comes out is quite rich in methane. The second stage needs a bit of cleanup. And the third stage, which is just below the surface of the lakes and 10, 12 meters down, is actually almost a pure 99% CO2 stream, which in the one instance you could wash out and put back into the lake, or you could take it out as a secondary product. You can
Talk me through that.
Methane, or you can make ethanol, you can make ethylene, you can make even protein as alternate products. And that stream alone is about 1 million tons a year when you're in full production. So it's, you imagine carbon pricing, we're talking just up the road here in BC, people talking about $150 a ton to produce CO2 to use like this. This can produce it at $1 a ton. So
Wow.
it's much cheaper.
Wow. And forget, the thought of saying, okay, it's a carbon dioxide is a negative item to the atmosphere. you've got a way of harvesting it and producing assets from it that is net beneficial and creates a net zero negative carbon footprint. Am I wrong in that, or
No, you're totally right, because the combination of these two things. By the way, is that, the gas we produce, the primary gas, is methane, and the primary gas produced, we're able to get about 5 times net methane out to shore from this as any other technology. So that is by itself a major change. And it's a stepwise thing. It relates to how much gas of the total resource we can access with this technology, because some of the others can't do the higher levels of it. It's not rich enough for them to operate. This Hydrgas process does operate there. So we get more methane out. Let's say net energy out to the wires, if we did it that way, would be between 3.8 and 5.1 times as much as the next best technology. But on top of that, we do have this secondary product, CO2, which we take out. Now, taking out those two and taking it out with that efficiency, there's one calculation I've done, and I haven't even completed it yet because I haven't worked out that CO2 component as part of it. But there's a well-known number in the US. They say coal produces about 916 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of power produced.
Okay.
Natural gas produces about between 380, I think, and 420 odd grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. If you do the math around the whole envelope here, we produce about minus 5,500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour.
Wow.
In other words, it's extremely strongly negative, carbon negative.
I mean, here in North America, as you're well aware, and other places in the world, as you alluded to, carbon capture is going through all kinds of experimental processes, and people are trying to make businesses out of carbon capture, and whether it be the oil and gas industry trying to put it back down into the ground, whether, as you said, in BC, there's people that are trying to pull it out of the air, and I'm sure there's lots others worldwide. But to say negative of that kind of volume, that's nothing to shake a stick at.
And that's before I add the million tons a year of carbon dioxide produced as a product. I mean, here we're talking about utilization as opposed to storage. There is a great big opportunity to store CO2 in this lake. Right now, if you work out the methane and use a 25 tons per ton multiplier to convert it into CO2, and remember, numbers now are ratcheting up to about 83 tons per ton. But at 25 tons per ton, combined with the CO2 in the lake, if this lake was to erupt, and we spoke about that earlier, it would release in a single day blow up, an eruption, 2 gigatons of carbon. 2 billion tons of carbon would be released inside a day. Now, that's catastrophic at an environmental level. It's more than catastrophic at a humanitarian level, because along with that 2 gigaton carbon release comes about 2,000 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide, which is in combination with the two. And here you've got a heavy gas which will settle low to the ground or low to the water effectively. That's a toxic spread of gas. People would survive less than a minute in that gas cloud.
Ultimately, then, you were part of this this group of experts that spent 3 years working on this. Why is this not of national importance to both DRC and Rwanda, in that they've got energy and they can divert catastrophic issues? Is it because they want private sector to deal with it, that they don't have the resources internally? What's the opportunity that Hydrogas has that others don't right now?
It's a big issue and it's a complex issue, and I give credit to both governments. They have been trying hard, in as much as they can afford it, in as much as they can support it. We're dealing with a unique, very complex situation at this lake. There is no precedent anywhere else that they can talk to. There's probably been as many PhDs given on this lake, the study of this lake, as, or certainly more than any other body of water on the planet, because of its complexity. It draws, it's like a magnet to academics that want to work in this space. So the understanding of it is complex. I mean, for us as a group of experts, and sure, barring me, all PhDs, took years and years to come to a better understanding of this topic. And amongst us, one of my colleagues, Dr. Finn Hirschland, has written a book, unpublished so far, but he's written a number of papers, one of which I co-wrote with him, about the dangers of the lake and about what has to be done. Now, even reading those papers kind of dulls the mind a little bit. There's so much technical detail, it's tough to digest. And I wouldn't expect many people at all. There's probably a few dozen people in the world that would really get into this topic. To expect government, ministers, public servants, etc., to have a full and detailed understanding of this is, I think, a bridge too far. They're looking for answers. They're looking to the expertise for answers. Unfortunately, the expertise goes so far, and then politics enters the situation.
Fair enough.
And one sees that politicians are able to, let's say, maneuver around the issues which should be of great concern. Now, if somebody believes that it's next generation or their grandchildren's problem, they're not as inclined to act on it as perhaps they should. But we do try to persuade them that the rules are there for a very good reason. Some of those who objected to the rules include some of the operators that are on the lake at the moment. And they're doing their best to effectively bypass them and not be held to account with those rules. They're recognized in law in both countries, so at least it should be there. But acting on transgressions, etc., has not been, let's say, thoroughly pursued. So we have the situation that I think there's an awareness of danger, but also with that awareness, a great deal of uncertainty of who's telling the truth about everything and whose projections of what can happen and will happen are up for debate.
Now, that's a great point to sort of say, okay, there's the promise of what can be done, and there's what others have actually been able to achieve, right? So the question comes around to Hydrgas at the same time. You say you can do this. You've got PhDs that have written all kinds of letters and papers to go with this. You're now at a point to say, you can follow the rules, and those rules in stages would be what? Like Hydrgas would do what next?
Well, Hydrgas, again, one of the rules that was set here is that if you come up with a new tech to be able to do this gas extraction, you must first prove it at a scale which we call demo.
Okay.
A demo would be the equivalent, for want of a better description, 5 megawatts of power production output.
For what period of time?
And the demo would only really need to run 3 to 6 months.
Okay.
Essentially to show what is happening underwater. Because this is, although the lake has this potential to be a huge and massive eruptive force, right now it's pretty static, it's pretty steady. it's layered. The movement of water at depth is extremely slow. So it's in a steady state situation now.
So you do this 5 megawatts for, call it 6 months.
Yeah.
And now what?
Well, now that would, again, under the rules, the recommended rules, that would enable you then to go and build out for as many concessions as you could get on either side of the lake, build out the capacity of the lake, which by current, let's go back to something, because if you've got a difference of productivity, what we recommended to the governments was that they license a quantity of resource to be used per year.
Interesting.
In other words, such a volume of water over 50 years, or 25 years plus another 25 years, you can use that volume of water. That is your concession.
So not a PPA, not your output, it's the input.
That is a key thing here. And this is where, for example, the concession that was given to Contour Global, and even the concessions that have come since to Symbion, were more based on output. Now, output says you're licensed to produce 100 megawatts to Kivuwat, Contour Global. You're licensed to produce 56 megawatts to Symbion, which is now Shema. They are essentially output focused. So whatever they produce is what they're licensed to do. Whether you use as much resource as Hydrgas does, or 4 times or 5 times as much, there's no regulation on that. So effectively, what Kivuwat could do is use all of Rwanda's allowance, and perhaps a little bit more, all their concessionable allowance, and produce 100 megawatts. If Kivuwat only does that, we at Hydrgas believe we can get somewhere between 300 and 400 megawatts out of what Rwanda's share of this is. So for the total lake, we could produce 600 to 800 megawatts instead of somewhere between 100 and 200.
So it's an asset of these countries that, to use your word, the harvest, right, is not being effectively managed, that once Hydrogas was able to prove through its demo of, say, a 5 megawatt project that, call it following the rules and dealing with the harvest rate, creates a renewable asset that can continue infinitum to these countries at a higher rate of output than they're currently getting. And Hydrogas becomes the winner in this whole scenario.
That is certainly the logic of what could, perhaps should happen here. You see, you asked the question earlier, I didn't answer it properly. One thing is that there's 2 families of technologies here. There's the legacy bunch,
yep,
and there's this newer bunch, which is driven by more advanced IP. And it's much more efficient in the process of how much of the lake it can harvest, at what depths it can harvest, how efficient that harvest is, how much parasitic energy losses is incurred along the way, how good a quality gas is produced. You know, we can produce pipeline quality gas, 90% methane as a product. The others are struggling to get much above 50%, which means it's like swamp gas and it runs very inefficiently in engines. You can't run gas turbines on it, for example.
right.
Whereas with the better quality output, you can run combined cycle gas turbines and get 60% or so generation efficiency.
Clean, dry gas, also good for cooking. Yeah.
And yes, we can produce this gas to shore, put it in a pipeline system and start supplying homes and even the whole country. We've done a study which looks at doing this in Rwanda. The same would apply in DRC as well. In DRC, essentially what you're trying to do is to try and find a way of replacing charcoal as a primary fuel in most homes. Goma has got about 1 million residents, most of them poor. Bukavu in the south of the lake are also about 1 million residents. And outside of that, there's plenty more. Rwanda also has a high population density, and we can get gas into households at a relatively cheap cost using let's call it a gas distribution and setup for homes, which I started with the World Bank back in Mozambique in about 1992. And it costs about $400 to $500 a home to get the home connected to gas, working for cooking and a couple of other utilities in the house. By doing that, you're short-circuiting the need to use charcoal, which is a primary fuel, which has accounted for the huge deforestation of the equatorial forest that surrounds its area. It's about 80 to 85% gone today.
$400 to $500 is pretty expensive for people that are living on dollars a day. I mean,
well, I connected my house to gas when I bought it here in Vancouver, and it cost me $10,000 just to connect from the street alone into the house and connect it up.
Strikes me that there's a canister business that could easily be something some entrepreneur could take on and grow as well. That's there, an LPG type business.
I've been in discussion with people that do that. The trouble with methane is it's not very compressible. There are some new techs, and one startup in Vancouver is doing this, where it's got a sort of cellular structure inside the tank, which seems to absorb the methane and release it at a less pressure. Otherwise, you've got a very high pressure cylinders, which are very expensive, not like your LPG.
Fair enough. Point well taken. Yeah. Point well taken.
The EU put in a pilot there in Rwanda in 1986. They were going to put connect vehicles with these tanks. The tanks are still lying there in the shed and with the compressors and everything. The loss of horsepower on the engine of the taxis, the minibus taxis they were using it in, was such that all the hills in Rwanda and you go nowhere. So it was tried and was thrown out in a matter of months. So it's got its potential, but the cheaper way to get gas into homes is to do it this way, literally. And as the World Bank adopted what I helped to build in Mozambique in 1992, they wanted it to, as part of the flaring initiative, to reduce gas flaring in the third world. And they wanted to take this project and spend $6 billion replicating it around 38 countries. So it is a way of doing it. And it is vastly cheaper by using the simpler, locally installed, locally run businesses to do that. I was talking about putting 10,000 women into small businesses as being gas distributors for their neighborhood. And the gas is connected literally to the house with a 2-plate burner and maybe a couple of other utilities.
It strikes me that there are many offshoots that are positive from just call it following the rules, going back to the very core of where this opportunity that Hydrgas continues to pursue is to say, but the rules are there for a reason, and they're there to create stability in the lake and renewable resource for the countries. Once that happens, look at the offshoot that you guys benefit from onwards and onwards. And ultimately, you at Hydrgas have a team around you, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit, about the resource and the team that you've that have followed you through thick and thin and that are dedicated to this ongoing for years now, is my understanding. And I've talked with some of them, but let's hear it from you about what it is that that you have as an asset in a team that can start putting this all together?
I guess it comes down to they buy into the dream. And it's a dream in the sense that when we first got into this, we started imagining how important it could be to the two countries neighboring this, and at least the sub-region around it. There's a 20 million people catchment around this lake that could be dependent on what goes on there. But you look at the impacts on their lives at several levels. The one is, yes, we can produce power here. We're working on the assumption that we'll produce this power at 50% of the cost of the alternate, which is diesel or HFO fueled power generation imports. So for the countries concerned, there is a massive reduction overall in the current account, the Forex current account for the countries, because here you've got an asset that can produce $1 billion worth of revenue a year for the next 50 years. That's how big it is. And that's just for the natural gas and power that would come out of this. The secondary ones like CO2 production, be it protein or ethanol to replace fuel, etc. These projects will be, when I say these projects, let's say the dozen or so units that we would build, 6 on each side of the lake, would account for the biggest industry in the country for the next perhaps 50 years.
Interesting.
Because of all of not only what it is as a power production unit, as a gas production distribution unit, but the secondary industries that can come on there, like be it protein production or ethanol production or whatever. And it becomes a kind of circular thing. You're looking at it as a scientist and you're saying, okay, what's the carbon balance over this whole thing? And what was essentially an ask 20 years ago, how can we get some gas out of this to make some power, has turned into, okay, here is a valid and very valuable ecosystem. How can you manage that ecosystem for greatest benefit to the people there?
Absolutely.
Now, the rules that we wrote as scientists, we set out 3 principles, which we said were the 3 important things that had to be looked at ahead of the commercial interests of anybody doing it. The first principle was public safety. We have to de-risk the lake from this potential to erupt and cause potentially millions of deaths. And that is the number 1 priority. And we believe we can do that. For example, based on our work, we think in 10 years, we can de-risk this lake by 90%. In other words, the potential of an incident happening is down by 90%. In 20 years, it's down 99%. And so it goes. But we've got to look beyond that and make sure, and this was a key point and one of the reasons we took so long to do this whole exercise as experts. We said we can't stop at 50 years and say our job is done. This is going to continue to be an issue for years and years to come. Now, what these non-compliant technologies are doing is not de-risking the lake by 90% in 10 years, they're actually adding risk because they're weakening the substrata of the lake, which is the primary protection against it going up. The second thing that has to be achieved is whereas there's a trend towards saturation by 2080, a volcanic incident just preempts any waiting for 2080. It could have happened last week if that was a big enough eruption. But what we've got to do is take down the critical contents of methane in the lake. We've got to literally take them from the top down and work it down to a point where it's 99% or 99.9% after 30 years reduced in danger, so that if an eruption happened and it spilled vast quantities of lava into the lake, it wouldn't be able to trigger a gas eruption. One of the key outcomes of this. So that's the public safety thing. The second thing was environmental safety. 2 gigatons of release. That is key, you know. That is 2 gigatons of carbon out in one day. Consider that the United States totally releases about 6 to 7 gigatons of carbon in a year. So a one-day incident is bigger than, say, 4 months of the total US carbon emissions. The third point was that it has to have a community benefit. And the community benefit has to be more important than the developer's benefit. And this is where we see cheaper energy in the form of natural gas to homes that can't afford electricity. Electricity to the country and to industries to be able to grow the economy. Those are key things.
As it is, we're at 59 minutes and 49 seconds. So is there any last things that you want to say about you or your company?
Well, yeah, look, as our company at this time, we are, I registered a startup in Canada late 2018 with the intent of doing this. As you might gather from what I've said about the importance of it and how my team has embraced this whole thing and wants to be part of it, it's that important that we're going to pursue it. And I am busy raising funds, talking to your organization, governments of Canada, etc., and really trying to push to get the funding for the demo project, which is about 35 million. Once we're done with that funding, we want to then fund a whole series of projects, for which, for example, I may be able to exercise the MOU that we wrote with the IFC and World Bank a number of years ago, which offers 75% of the project funding that we need for all commercial stages thereafter. So that is what we would like to be able to do. We've got about a 10 to 15 year mission to complete this whole series of projects.
Well, Philip, thank you very much. And as it happens, happy Africa Day. Enjoy your day. And this has been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed our chat today, and I look forward to ongoing discussions with this. For all the listeners, they'll be able to find links to your website and other information you've referenced in the show notes, and we'll be able to go from there. So good stuff.
Well, I'm looking forward to the ride. I'm really energized for it, and it's going to be great, I believe.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Energy and Africa. I'm your host, Chris McLean. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, stonechaircapital.com, to your friends and colleagues. And please, leave us a positive review on all your social platforms. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts and videos. Check us out on Twitter and LinkedIn. Details are all on the show notes. Join us next time for another edition of Energy and Africa.